Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Independent Sector's webinar, Put Your Voice Where Your Mission Is. My name is Allison Grayson, and I'd like to welcome you this afternoon. I'm really excited to be able to host this webinar, particularly because in 2016, Independent Sector did a poll that asked voters what their expectations were for the nonprofit sector. And 70% of voters responded to say that they are expecting charitable organizations to play a greater role in partnering with government to solve problems. That partnership, to a certain extent, will require advocacy. So in a way of filling that expectation that the public has for the charitable sector, we wanted to have a conversation today about how do we get that started. It's also particularly timely following the 2016 elections. Lots of organizations have a renewed interest and passion for figuring out how they can engage in and participate in the public policy process. So today's webinar, we're really trying to figure out where you can get started, what are the hurdles you need to anticipate, and how to align your organization, your board, and your volunteers and resources in a way that can start moving your advocacy objectives forward. So with that, I want to introduce our two speakers that we have with us today. First, I will introduce Ann Wallestad. Ann is the president and CEO of BoardSource. She is an experienced trainer and facilitator who's worked with boards and volunteer networks to strengthen volunteer management, events, and fundraising skills. Since taking the helm of BoardSource in 2013, she's overseen a period of significant growth and change for the organization, including the launch of several new leadership initiatives, one of which you will hear about this afternoon. Prior to joining BoardSource's leadership team in 2008, she held leadership positions with the Gay and Lesbian Victory Fund and Leadership Institute, the Boys and Girls Clubs of Central Iowa, the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network, and Human Rights Campaign. I'd also like to introduce with us today, we have Gary Bass, Executive Director of the Bauman Foundation. Gary also is an affiliated professor at Georgetown University's McCourt School of Public Policy. He founded and for 28 years directed OMB Watch. His areas of expertise include federal government operations, ways of strengthening nonprofit advocacy, and improving government transparency. At the Bauman Foundation, he leads efforts to address economic inequality, promote government transparency, strengthen government accountability, improve the regulatory process, encourage civic participation. He's also involved in redistricting reforms and promoting a fair and accurate census. And my name is Allison Grayson. I am the Director of Policy Development and Analysis here at Independent Sector, and I will help facilitate today's discussion. But we were really excited to have Ann and Gary join us today. Before we get started, we wanted to have a little poll for those of you who are able to join us, just to get a sense of where you are on this topic. So on a scale of 1 to 5, how frequently does your organization currently engage in public policy or advocacy, 1 being never and 5 being on a daily basis? I'm gonna pause for a minute. Okay, I think it's kind of leveled out. So it seems like quite a few people do engage in some form of public policy and advocacy. So you have some familiarity with what it means to engage in this kind of work. Maybe not every day. So it sounds like it looks like 31% sort of, or somewhere in the middle. And I think that looks about right. So we will try to manage how we talk about this topic this afternoon with the understanding that a lot of you already are engaging in some policy work, but you know, it looks like there are some of you who never engage in it. So we want to make sure that we are making sure that everybody is on the same page. So thank you. And we are going to now move on to our next slide. and talk about our agenda. The first thing we'll talk about is what is advocacy. The reason we're going to talk about this, and I'll get to it in just a minute, is there's actually research that any conversation around advocacy, even those people who engage in it constantly, there is a lack of understanding or consensus among everybody as to exactly what you're talking about. So just to kind of make sure we're all on the same page for the purpose of this webinar, we're going to quickly talk about what is advocacy, 2 seconds, make sure we're all on the same page, and then we'll launch into the rest of our discussion for today. We're going to talk about a vision for nonprofit advocacy, and Gary's going to walk us through sort of the big picture of why you advocate or why nonprofits increase the amount of advocacy that they do in given circumstances. It'll also provide us with some great talking points should we be trying to convince our colleagues, our leadership, or our networks that they need to engage in more advocacy. Then we'll talk about overcoming organizational hurdles, the sort of typical challenges that organizations face that prevent them from engaging in as much advocacy as they would like. And then finally, how to get your board on board with advocacy. And Anne is going to share a great new initiative. Well, it's not even that new, Anne. It's established at this point. A great initiative that BoardSource has spearheaded to do just that. So if we can start with what is advocacy, and mostly it's just to clear the air for those who may not be familiar. There is this giant space that we call public policy, and that's just all of the ways in which decisions are made that influence the environment in which nonprofits do their work. That is made by elected officials, that's made by government bureaucrats. It's even made by some private institutions that govern different kinds of rules and oversight for nonprofits. It also involves research and education, and Gary will get into this a bit more as to the difference between all three of these, but within public policy, there is the activity of advocacy, which is generating public support or creating a recommendation for a particular cause or policy. And then we have lobbying, and lobbying is a form of advocacy, but it's a much smaller subset where you seek to influence a politician or a public official on a specific piece of legislation or regulation. So often when we talk about public policy or advocacy, people are thinking about lobbying, and we just want to make sure we're discussing sort of the broader spectrum of advocacy in today's conversation. And Gary is going to get into a little more detail about what all of these pieces mean and how they interact with one another in just a moment. So I think we're ready to start our conversation. Gary, I'm going to turn it over to you, and I think you're going to get us going by helping us find the talking points for making the case for increasing our advocacy engagement. Gary?
Well, thanks, Allison. I can't imagine a better time to have this conversation. In at least, my 35 plus years of being a professional advocate, I don't think there is a time where we need the nonprofit's voice more than right now. But I've got to say, doing this comes with challenges. You see in front of you a quote from an archbishop, and it's really true. When we do services, everyone thinks we do great things. When we question systemic issues, people criticize many of us in the nonprofit sector. And this is a challenge we face. I do want to come back to the definition that Allison was talking about of advocacy. Most of us tend to think of that little center that she was talking about that dealt with lobbying. And for me and many people who have been looking at advocacy, it's much bigger. Now, first of all, let me start off by saying I'm not an artist, and the circle is not the best drawing. And for that matter, advocacy isn't linear or circular, it's amoeba-like. And not every nonprofit does all the things I'm going to talk about. But the effective nonprofit leader knows about all of these different elements and knows who to go to get help for each of these. So as I said, in the lower right-hand side are what most of us often think of when we talk about advocacy. They tend to be the campaigns, like organizing and lobbying and media advocacy, those kinds of things. But if you start up in the upper right-hand side, most of us are already involved in advocacy of one type or another in the nonprofit community, and we don't necessarily call it that. For example, many of us will do research to further our agendas, and there's all kinds of research, whether it's the policy analysis work that many in the nonprofit sector do, or whether it's public opinion or empirical research. And often that research will lead to the next item, which is policy options. And we rely on this research to talk about the why of what should be done and how it should be done. And many of us have come up with various kinds of policy options, either for the state legislature or a local mayor to come up with alternatives and what should be done. Moving down through that line, I've already mentioned campaigns, but I will say for many of us in the nonprofit sector, we think of advocacy as pretty much the things on the far side, and this right side of the circle. When we come down to the bottom, there's a whole area that most of us are quite familiar with, but we don't do a lot on, which is once a law is passed, it needs to be implemented. And how it gets implemented is often through the regulatory structure. And we don't spend a lot of time and energy in the same way we do on the campaigns engaging in a lot of that work. On top of that, you can go look at the environmental community or the civil rights community, and for many in the nonprofit community, it was really their enforcement, looking at the enforcement of the regulations and the laws and determining how those were being implemented that were really important. For example, I'm thinking down in Louisiana, there's the bucket brigades looking at the quality of the water. In civil rights community, people were going around and verifying whether various laws are actually being enforced. And of course, given it's the United States and given the society we're in, you sue them, right? Litigation is a key part of the advocacy cycle for all nonprofits. And the last area, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention it, given we just came through a national election, is voter engagement. And there's all types of areas in which civic engagement, voter participation, nonpartisan voter registration, nonpartisan get out the vote, that play a very critical role in the whole advocacy cycle. And what you see sort of in the middle of this whole diagram is things that are consistent always. We have to do fundraising, capacity building, and public education. Now, I mention all these things because odds are they're all familiar to you. You just don't necessarily think of them in the context of advocacy. But the point is that advocacy is much, much broader than the campaigns that we do. And I would say that advocacy is about trying to create change on behalf of a collective interest and trying to change an institutional elite, whether that's government or, for that matter, other power bases in our society. So this forms much of the conversation going forward. Advocacy isn't necessarily as foreign to you as you may think. I also wanted to mention in the campaign portion, and Allison mentioned lobbying. Lobbying is completely legal for 501c3 nonprofit organizations. There are limits in the amounts you can do, but it is completely permissible. And I'm going to return to that in a minute here. Now, I've got to say, there are lots of arguments for engaging and lots of arguments for not engaging in advocacy. I just want to take you on a very quick tour of a few things that people have said to me in research we've done through focus groups and interviews of nonprofit leaders. One of the key things people talk about is the historical role. You know, it's rare that we talk about advocacy on a webinar and start talking about Tocqueville, but The reality is Tocqueville saw this in our country when he came and visited from France. He saw the notion of associations. And even prior to his visit, the very fundamental concept of associations in this country, baked into our DNA, if you will, of America, is the right of advocacy. We did it from the points of Committee of Correspondence when the American Revolution was occurring. This is an essential part of our makeup. And it isn't just historical. You know, you think about the First Amendment, things we've gone to war on. We have very basic rights in that First Amendment that include the notion of being able to lobby. It's an essential component of our basic rights. I would also say that many of the nonprofit leaders view advocacy as a moral responsibility. And I would also add, it is, as I mentioned early, legal to do. The IRS regulations on this are very clear that the engagement on advocacy is totally permissible in your 501c3 work. So I really want to make clear that all of this is absolutely above board and permissible. And probably the most important reason that I've heard for engaging in advocacy is sort of that mission-driven purpose. It really helps us carry out our mission. Now, I don't want to ignore that there are lots of reasons for not engaging, but I'll just rapidly point out that a lot of people say it's not the purpose of our organization. The funders may be upset if we engage in advocacy because we may alienate them or anger them. It could also, if you're getting government funds, create a potential conflict and result in loss of those funding. A lot of groups are just swamped. You don't have the time to engage, or you don't have the capacity and skill development. And of course, lastly, I think a lot of organizations misconstrue advocacy as being political in the sense of being partisan. I'm proud, very proud as a nonprofit organization to be partisan for the issues I believe in, whether it's about low income issues or whether it's about the arts or whatever it may be. I'm proud to be a partisan. So these are just a few arguments. I think they're things you know. All of us have seen in the last month or so now a growth of a lot of organizations. You may have heard of Indivisible or Wall of Us, or there's a slew of new groups coming along. And I just want to highlight the importance of why we engage. And I hardly need to dwell on a lot of these issues because some of you are already involved in public policy, as the survey showed. But the reality is, unlike ever before, we see in everything we do in the nonprofit world, the intervening and actually corrupting influence of money in politics and policy making. And it's drifted all the way down to the state level. I could take you down issues that are, you know, intimately. You look at the rising income inequality today. It has been growing since really the 1980s and steadily on the increase to the point where we're back to the era of the 1920s and 1930s. And this data comes from Thomas Piketty. But I can also, for me, most compelling as a reason to be engaged in advocacy today is this chart right here on political inequality, not just income inequality. If you look at the bottom of the chart, what you see is the 0 to 95% is those in like polling data that says they support a particular issue. And on the axis going up and down is the likelihood of Congress adopting it. And what this red line reflects is average citizens. Basically what it's saying is it doesn't matter how many people support the policy. Basically, average citizens hold pretty much even. You add in one more line from this research that was done on economic elites, and what you see is a vastly different kind of scaling. As more economic elites support a particular policy issue, the likelihood of adoption goes up. It's not to say that the economic elites always win. What it's to say is this is a real issue today where the average person, average citizens, the nonprofit community may be having a harder time than the economic elites in convincing electeds that something should get done. And turn around, I mean, my wife is from Flint, and so I go back there, and this is a very personal issue. It isn't just the Flints of America. You know, the problem is that this is occurring in our schools. We need to make sure that things like water is safe to drink, and we can't have our government telling us it's safe to drink when it's not. You know, I put up some dates going back from 2014 to 2015, where the message was over and over again, things are safe, when in fact they weren't. I can take you to about a week ago when in Michigan the decision was to stop reimbursing and paying for the water bills because the argument is the water is safe, and in fact it's still not there. You could turn around and look at racial tensions in our cities today. You could move to structural issues like gerrymandering, redistricting. This particular slide I find fascinating. I could do this with a lot of states, but this is from 2012 data in Pennsylvania. The left hand of the slide says basically the electorate in Pennsylvania was pretty well divided evenly between Democrats and Republicans. But then you look at the congressional makeup on the right-hand side, and you see it's very skewed. This is a trend that's happening in many, many states at the state legislature also. These factors influence our ability as a nonprofit sector to have influence and to make things change. But rather than sort of go hairy-carry and go, oh my God, this is so terrible, I think we, the nonprofit sector, are actually the answer to a lot of this. And I just wanted to spend a couple minutes here quickly running through a kind of process or an idea of how strategically we should think of advocacy. In the upper right-hand side is what I would call the virtuous circle. That is, if we elect the right kinds of people with public interest values, it will include better policies. If we reinforce that, we will have fair elections with high voter turnout, which will lead to even better electeds. All this is a virtuous cycle that goes round and round. The problem today is that we have a vicious cycle that intervenes. The influence of money in politics, income inequality. Take your pick as to what they are, the capture of legislation and regulation. Our job as a nonprofit sector is to figure out strategies to minimize that vicious circle and accentuate and structure the virtuous circle. So I want to talk a little bit for a minute here about overcoming some barriers inside your organization. We've talked a little bit about the why, we've talked about what is advocacy, and we were talking about a strategic whole, but really all energy on advocacy is going to start within your organization. There's no absolute panacea or one size fits all for answers on this. This is based on research that's been done over the last decade, and here are a couple ideas. The first one is it's really important to talk about advocacy with your board and your staff. And Ann's going to talk much more about the board side of things in a minute here. But I do want to say that if inside your organization, people look to the leaders of the organization to set the direction. If your executive staff and your board are encouraging and promote advocacy, it will filter down throughout the organization. Too many times we just jump in advocacy and we don't really set the right scenario and the right temperament and environment for the organization. Also, I think the other is you need to have the procedures inside your organization to make the policy decisions easier. I was thinking of an example where one organization talked about they couldn't take action until their board approved action on each and every item. Well, the problem was that the board didn't meet until after the state legislature took action on a particular item. So the procedures didn't match the reality of how things have to occur. The point being that you really need to talk about making sure you have procedures, whether it's a board committee or whether it's having real authority for your executive director to make decisions. A third point that I want to raise the research found, even though I was suggesting to make your executive director have policy authority, the worst thing in our research found is to assign day-to-day responsibilities for advocacy to the executive director. And it sort of makes sense. The executive director has a lot to do. And if that person, he or she has the advocacy responsibilities, odds are it's going to get, not the highest priority, because you got to do fundraising or you got to do staff issues to deal with crises. So the recommendation is you want your executive director all the way involved, but to the extent you can find a surrogate who will take this on, whether it's a governmental affairs staff or a volunteer or a board member, you actually have a better propensity for engaging in advocacy than when it's assigned to the executive director. I would say the fourth idea is make sure you don't have all your staff on a government grant. If you're getting local, state, or federal grants, as you know, you cannot use government money for lobbying, and in many cases, broadly advocacy. So you don't want all your staff 100% on those grants. The fifth point I would say is research shows that the more you join associations, the more you participate in coalitions, the greater likelihood your organization will be involved in advocacy. And so it's strongly recommended to find ways to do that. And my last point is obviously get training, whether it's on the legal rules where I mentioned lobbying is legal, advocacy is legal for a 501c3, whether it's developing policy strategies like the virtuous cycles I talked about, whether it's skill building on how to be an advocate and how to lobby. Those are all the kinds of things that you want to build the training and capacity for the organization. Let me stop there and turn back to you, Ann.
Wonderful, thank you. And I have a slide that's going to come up here about getting your board on board. And really, when we talk about getting the board on board, it's for two reasons. One, just as Gary pointed out, it doesn't make sense, and it's in fact very difficult and even dangerous for an organization to be incredibly engaged in advocacy if the board is not supportive. So you really do need leadership from the top, understanding from the top, support from the top to be engaging organizationally in advocacy. But the other reason, and I would argue the more exciting and important reason to get the board on board, is that the board is actually very uniquely positioned to engage as advocates for your mission. They have access, they have influence, and they have credibility. And so there's real power in thinking about how to leverage your board members as advocates for your mission. So 4 things that I would offer as advice in terms of how to get your board on board. And these are largely sequential. The first step is really about articulating what's at stake for your organization. And that means both opportunities and challenges or threats. For board members to be supportive of advocacy as a strategy, they really need to understand, what are we talking about? What does this mean for our organization? So just as an example, for organizations that receive government funding, whether through a contract or through a government grant, helping the board understand to what extent the budget of the organization is funded by government support. A board's orientation to advocacy is going to be really shaped, if they start to understand that 60% of the organization's funding is coming from government sources, which means the organization has a real obligation to engage with decision makers to make sure that they understand how the organization is making use of those funds and how they are serving the community or their mission otherwise. But it does go beyond just funding, because certainly for all organizations, we're operating within a policy environment. We're not in a vacuum. And so the things that we do impact the larger system, but importantly, this larger system also impacts us. So helping the board understand, both from a sector-wide perspective, but also a mission-specific perspective, how are the decisions that are being made around us impacting our ability to do our work? And again, it's both opportunities and threats. So there may be things that you know, you're really kind of stuck in terms of the way that your organization is doing its work. And if there were a policy change, you would be able to do that work much more impactfully or efficiently even. Similarly, there might be things that are going quite well in terms of the way that you're doing your work, but if there is a policy change, that could all change immediately. And so helping the board really understand what's at stake. And by doing so, you're really making the case that we don't have the option to not engage in advocacy. Not engaging in advocacy is sort of putting our heads in the sand. And board members need to understand what actually we're talking about when we're talking about the policy environment in which our organizations are working and what it would mean for our mission to not engage. Second advice is really to think about how to help board members overcome myths. And the way to do that, of course, is through education. So Gary touched on some of this, but three things that I would highlight in terms of the myths that need to be overcome. First, there is a sense for some board members that engaging in advocacy is off mission. So going back to that first point around articulating what's at stake, it's really important to help board members understand that this is not something that you would contemplate doing instead of your mission oriented work. This is something that you're doing because of your mission-oriented work. And so helping them really understand how engagement in advocacy is advancing or protecting your organization's ability to fulfill its mission. The second thing that I would highlight that can be a real myth for board members is this sense that engagement in advocacy is political, and specifically in a partisan or candidate-oriented way. And it's not. So we're talking about policy engagement. This is not about candidates, at least when we're talking about advocacy being done by 501c3 organizations. And in fact, just to put a fine point on that, there's a proposal or a debate going on that I'm sure many of you are familiar with right now that would actually change the rules and make it possible for nonprofit organizations to endorse or support candidates. And that is a recommendation or a proposal that both independent sector and BoardSource and many others in the sector object to, because we believe that it's really important for nonprofit organizations to have a policy focus in their engagement and advocacy, and to really be focused on how you find solutions to move missions forward and to support our communities, separate from the sort of overly politicized political partisan environment. And the third one, and Gary touched on this as well, is simply the myth that advocacy is not allowed. Many board members have gotten misinformation or have the misunderstanding that it is inappropriate or even illegal for a 501c3 organization to engage in advocacy. And of course, that's not true. It is allowed, and in fact, it is, as Gary said, it's our right, and I would argue our responsibility as nonprofit organizations to engage in conversations about policy and their impact on our missions and the people that we serve and support. So those are three really important things that are important to help a board overcome. And I would roughly put them in that order. I think sometimes we start by diving into all of the sort of rules and legalities, but we really need to make the case for why it's important first. The third advice that I would offer in terms of getting your board on board is really around defining parameters for engagement. And what I mean when I say that is really about getting on the same page about what your goals are, what your underlying organizational values are that will guide your decision making, and then how you'll define roles and parameters in terms of advocacy engagement. And to oversimplify a little bit, it's about defining what are you going to do, why are you doing it, and what are the kind of rules for play. And when it comes to those rules, we absolutely do recommend that organizations formalize their kind of rules of play as a part of a formal policy. But before you can do that, you really just need to have an honest conversation in the boardroom about what are we absolutely not talking about in terms of the way that our organization wants to engage in advocacy. What is the sort of, yes, of course, we are absolutely going to engage here. And then what's in the middle? And I would say that the goal of a policy formation conversation is to get as much clarity and be able to put as much as possible in the definitely not and the absolutely yes category, so that the things that are gray, which are then naturally the things that need to come back to the board for some sort of conversation, are as few and far between as absolutely possible. And that's for exactly the reason that Gary highlighted, which is the way that boards are structured, the fact that we are meeting, you know, quarterly or maybe monthly, means that if you are trying to wait to have a full board conversation about everything that you might want to do or engage on in terms of advocacy, you're going to be too slow. You're going to miss the opportunity. And so really trying to think in advance about what's definitely not okay, what definitely is, and then keeping the sort of world of, you know, we're not sure we would have to look at it to as small a scope as possible. As a part of that, you have the opportunity to really talk about what's the appropriate role for board members to play in advocacy and what's the appropriate role for staff members to play in advocacy. One of the things that we've heard here at BoardSource when we talk about board engagement and advocacy, and this comes primarily from executive directors, but it can come from board members or other staff as well, is, you know, oh my gosh, we're going to be so disorganized. We're going to have all these board members that are running all over the place, and we're doing all these different things, and we're not going to be speaking with one voice. And the comparison that I would make is to board engagement in fundraising. And I know that probably sounds a little bit funny, but the reason that I say that is we absolutely need board members to be involved in fundraising. They have the access. They have the ability to make calls that can break through and get the attention that we need. They have the opportunity to speak with real credibility and passion about why the work of the organization is so important to them. And it's perceived differently than when that is coming from a paid staff member for the organization. But they need to be doing that work in partnership and coordination with the staff. And advocacy is no different. You would no sooner say, no, I don't want to engage my board members in fundraising than you should be saying in terms of advocacy. But it does require that partnership, and it requires that thoughtfulness, that coordination, that communication. And when you build that discipline and set those expectations between and across board and staff, it can be incredibly, incredibly powerful. And then the fourth thing that I would say, and we touched on this a little bit, is really taking the time to think big about leveraging the board's unique value. There are something like 1.5 million nonprofit organizations in the US alone. And based on what we know about average board sizes, that means that there are somewhere around 20 million board members in the United States. That is a huge asset for the nonprofit sector. That is influence. That is reach. That is huge opportunity for us. And that is the thing that I think is so incredibly exciting in thinking about greater board engagement and advocacy. There's a huge opportunity for the nonprofit sector to access some of that power and influence that we have available to us, but that we're just not tapping into. And that's, I think, the really exciting thing to think about when we're talking about sort of points of leverage within the sector and within advocacy as a strategy. Building on that, if we can go to the next slide, Allison mentioned in her intro that BoardSource has really been focused on how can we tap into that potential that we have as a nonprofit sector to really lift up board members' voices and to accelerate our advocacy efforts by doing so. So in support of that goal, BoardSource, along with our colleagues at the National Council of Nonprofits, the Forum of Regional Association of Grantmakers, the Alliance for Justice, the Campion Foundation, and many others have launched an initiative that we're calling the Stand for Your Mission campaign. And Stand for Your Mission is really about making the case for board engagement and support of advocacy. You have a website on the bottom of the slide there. That website is full of resources that both make the case for why board members should be involved, but then provide practical tools and resources to help staff and boards think about how you actually do that. And the kind of core resource of that campaign is a discussion guide, which we encourage organizations to literally bring into the boardroom to guide a conversation about where are we in relation to our engagement in advocacy and where do we want to be, and really starting to think about what the next level of engagement in advocacy would mean for our organization. Another thing that is really important to mention as a part of the Stand for Your Mission campaign is one of the things that we at BoardSource heard a lot before we launched this campaign, and actually heard this from some of our colleagues in the sector, is that there was this sense that even if an organization was engaging in advocacy, that board members, that was not their responsibility, or that was not really a role that board members should be playing. And so we felt that it was so important to make it clear that board members do have a role to play in advocacy, and that they are missing opportunities to support their mission and really serve in the way that board members can and should if they're not engaging in advocacy. We actually changed one of our core books, The 10 Basic Responsibilities of Nonprofit Boards, to reflect that, and added the expectation of board engagement and advocacy as a part of those 10 basic roles and responsibilities. That's how important we felt it was to make it really clear that this is not just a nice to do or an extra thing to add to the list. It's really core to a board member's responsibility in terms of supporting the organization's mission and advancing its work. So I'm going to pause there because I know we really want to leave time for questions and discussion based on what you're interested in talking about. So I will hand it back to Allison to lead that.
Thank you so much, Anne and Gary. I think there was a lot of information that you guys just shared with us. So I'm going to try to repeat back what I heard as far as some simple steps that organizations may want to consider as they're trying to either initiate or ramp up the advocacy that they're doing. And I want you to let me know if I'm wrong. And while I'm doing this, I want to remind people there is a Q&A button on your screen. If you have questions for our speakers, please feel free to click that and type your question into the box, and we'll try to make sure that our speakers get to as many questions as possible during the remaining time on this call. So Anne and Gary, this is what I heard. I heard distilled down 6 major steps that nonprofits can take to increase their advocacy. One is to make sure the organization discusses its advocacy engagement strategy amongst both staff and volunteers, which I heard includes defining what policy and advocacy is, or clarifying how it relates to lobbying. But also, Anne, you emphasized that this discussion needs to make a case for why advocacy is important for the organization's mission, and tying it back to that. The second step that I heard from both Anne and Gary is creating a structure or rules for deciding how to engage in advocacy within an organization, so that nonprofits can quickly and efficiently mobilize when they see opportunities or needs to participate in the public policy space. And you had said maybe at the board level, setting parameters of buckets where organizations will always engage in advocacy on these issues, and an area where organizations will never engage in advocacy, and try to get those as clear as possible on the front end so there's less gray area. The third step that I heard is to create a culture of advocacy from the top down in the organization's leaders. And I think between the two of you, that would include both staff leaders and volunteer leaders at the board level. And I have a question for you that I'm going to follow up in just a minute on that point. Step 4, I heard assign tasks to someone else in the organization other than the executive director when it comes to the day-to-day work of advocacy and public policy. And as Gary said, that could be a staff level person, a volunteer. It also could be a board member. And then the 5th step is join coalitions that will help you share resources and intelligence and sort of stretch your capacity. And then the 6th step, I will just assign as get your organization ready to be an advocate, which would be have staff or board members engage in training that helps them become more comfortable as far as how to be an advocate, strategies, tips, tricks on what it means to go to Hill visits or what it means to send out action alerts to members. These are sort of the major tips that I've heard so far. And of course, we have lots of resources that are out there in the community that will delve into some of this in more detail. But does this sound like the way to get started?
I would probably tack on 3 items on how to just get the ball rolling. And maybe I'll clue you in, since it's a funny story, because I won't hear you laugh, so I'm going to get you ready. I was on our subway system, the Metro, and those of you who've been in DC, you know you don't talk a lot on the Metro. You put your head down and read a newspaper or read something. And I happened to be on one of those trains going to the airport, and sure enough, at the opposite end of the train was someone who saw me, and I had my head buried reading, and she screamed out, she goes, "Hey, Gary!" And, I tried to ignore her, like, it's not me, please, it's not me. And she goes, Gary, did you hear what they did? And this was on a nursing home reform bill. And so I looked at her and looked up, and I said, oh, what'd they do? And she's screaming across the car about what they did on nursing home reform. And people are getting off at the next stop and talking about this crazy lady. And then the next stop. And so then I realized, ooh, this might be a strategy. And so I got off at the airport with her, and I said, do you do this often? She goes, oh, yes, you should get them in the elevator. They got no place to go. And I think that's really what we need to be doing to get the ball rolling. We've got to be talking about our issues again. We've got to have the energy to just do it, to just jump out there and talk about it. And advocacy is a lot like exercise. The first time you do it, you're going to be achy. It's not going to work right. It's going to be sore. But once you get going, you're going to feel great. And so I think the first steps, you gave a great list. I would publish that list and send it around. But I also think it's just start something up and start remembering why we care about what we do. Be proud of our issues. The defense industry isn't afraid about talking about more money. Why shouldn't we be doing the same? So that's one piece I would just throw in on how to get the ball rolling.
That's great. Thanks, Gary. I think this will segue into the next a question from a participant who says, what we talked about so far is pretty high level. So do you have tips on how to take the first steps after this? What comes next? And in particular, they ask about engaging grassroots followers, but I think maybe you could also speak to the extent to which grassroots engagement is necessary for different types of advocacy.
I think the story I just told is that first step. I had seen the question, and that's why I was frankly adding to your list. I do think if the issue is, there are 2 issues in the question. One is, how do we move within our own organization? And then the other is, how do we move others? And I think today there is enormous energy. That's why I had that one slide about all these new efforts, whether it's indivisible or other things. It's remarkable, the energy level. I think what we need to be doing as nonprofits is now tapping into it. We have the expertise. We have the nonpartisan knowledge. We have the issues. And we should be sharing this with people about getting them more engaged. So I think the first hurdle is getting this sorted out within our organizations, including what Ann talked about at the board level and at the staff level to get fully buy-in. And then I think the next step is reaching out to our members and to our community about our issues.
Yeah, and I would just add, I know this wasn't quite the question, but I think that one of the I'll just say mistakes that we make sometimes when we're communicating with boards about advocacy is we go straight to the how. You know, so we're gonna do this, and this is what this is gonna look like. And I think one of the reasons that we don't have more kind of groundswell at the board level for engagement in advocacy than we do is because we've too often skipped the why. And it's the why for your mission. And when we start there, it is a much different conversation for board members because it is so clear that we are not talking about partisan politics. It's so clear that we are not talking about, you know, a particular elected official. It is about our mission and our ability to do that. And when we start with why, it is a radically different conversation.
You know, just to piggyback on that, of how we get our grassroots engaged, you know, I'm reminded in focus groups that we did of nonprofit leaders and of board members, people are really hesitant to use the word advocacy. They're really afraid to use the word lobbying. They're more comfortable with education. But I've got to say, we tie ourselves into a pretzel to avoid some of these words, and sometimes it's ridiculous. I remember in one focus group where people were talking about this one person went to the state legislator and to the legislator staff about more money for the program. This was in Texas. And so then the moderator of the focus group asked the question, do you engage in advocacy? And the person said, oh no, we don't do any advocacy. We do impact analysis. Whatever you want to call it, it's fine. I think that the issue is not so much of what you call it as much as the kinds of items I talked about in the range of advocacy activities that you put that together in a strategic whole, and that you start to reach out to the grassroots and that you start to reach out to your members. That's, I think, the big beginnings for us.
Great.
Allison, I'm noticing that we have a couple of questions about specific legalities and also guidelines about legalities, and particularly guidelines framed in a way that will resonate with board members. And I'll just point folks, I'm sure there are other places that you can access these resources, but if you go to the Stand for Your Mission site, there are a number of resources that help outline what we're talking about when we're talking about advocacy and what 501c3 organizations, as well as other types of organizations, can and cannot do that are framed. There are even PowerPoint decks that make it easy to bring that right into the boardroom to present that at a level that's appropriate for board members. But I'll also point folks to, if you have very specific legal questions, the Alliance for Justice is a tremendous resource, and they have a free technical support hotline. So, you know, for example, for the person that's curious about whether or not there are particular rules or regulations for them, given that their organization is located on federal grounds, that would be a great place to be able to ask a really good specific question and have an attorney respond.
We need to come up with I'm horrible on not only drawing, given the circles I did, but on top of it, I'm not good at coming up with great memes or themes, but we need a statement like, I would say just do it, but someone's taken that one. We need, you know, advocacy is now. But that's what we really need, is to translate what Ann, you were just saying, into something that makes it easier for everyone. The legalities, by the way, they are very permissible, and we can get caught up all day in going through what is the proper amount. And every time I do a training on the lobby law and the lobby regulations, everyone gets caught up in, oh my goodness, I've got to do this. But the limits, the permissible limits, are so great, so high, that very, very few of us are ever going to bump up against the caps on lobbying. very few of us. So that's why I want to have a just do it kind of campaign. We've got to generate that energy again.
I agree, Gary. That's a great idea. To follow up with your comment in response to these two questions on legal questions around advocacy and lobbying, following this webinar, we will be sending out an email that will include a survey asking you to evaluate it, but it'll also include some links to specific resources, including Stand for Your Mission, Boulder Advocacy, which is Alliance for Justice's advocacy initiative, is also included in that, and a couple of other links. And I say that because there is such a wealth of information that already exists in training on the legality. There are one-pager flyers, there are other entire webinars. Independent Sector has done some, but there's so much out there. We wanted to make sure that we just let you know where those resources are and how to find them. And in addition, some of these resources also delve into the how-tos in a little more detail. So we have that that is coming to you. And I will say also, if you have, and actually, if we can just go ahead and advance to the last slide. If you have any additional questions once we send this out that you can't seem to find information, and I see there's a question about the hotline from Alliance for Justice, that will be in the email that we will send out following this webinar. But if there's any additional questions you have that you can't find on those resources that we send out, please feel free to contact us at Independent Sector. We want to make engaging in advocacy for either your organization or your network as easy as possible and as seamless as possible, because we know that it's important for missions to be able to impact the environment in which you work. It's the way to get to greater impact. So with that, I want to thank Gary and Ann for all of the insight that you've provided on today's call. We have just a short time left. If you have any closing thoughts that you'd like to share before we go.
Ann, do you want to go, or?
Go for it.
Probably the only thing I feel I didn't give enough attention to in the questions about how to get the ball rolling is really linking up in coalitions and other associations. I think there's a lot of literature, a lot of research that shows the power and magnitude and importance of coalition building. And that's a great way of saving your resources as well as getting energized. And part of this is building a sense of community.
Yeah, that was exactly the thing that I was gonna say or add as well, and particularly on those important sector-wide issues, that may not be the right place to start your conversations in your boardroom or to start your advocacy work as an organization, but there are really important issues that impact all of us as nonprofit organizations. And we are lucky to have organizations like Independent Sector and the National Council of Nonprofits and our state associations that are really helping us to identify what those issues are and figure out how as a sector we can come together and engage. And it's really important that we do so.
Great. Thank you both so much. I will say the email that's going out will have some information on how to join coalitions, because I agree that's critically important. But also, if you are experiencing challenges trying to identify coalitions in your subject matter area or in your region that you can join based on the issues you're interested in, again, let us know and we'll be glad to link you with the appropriate organizations as we are able to identify resources for you. So with that, I know we are out of time, but again, thank you to Ann and Gary for everything that you've done, and thank you to everybody participating on the webinar today. We're so excited to be able to share this with you. Oh, excuse me, and it looks like it's time to go. So thank you, and we will be in touch.